Hello and good afternoon. Happy Wednesday, September 18th. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The New NAFTA, How the USMCA Affects the TN Visa. Before we dive into the main presentation, I just would like to remind everyone that today's webinar, first, will be recorded, and you will receive a link to download that recording tomorrow afternoon. You'll also receive a link to download the slide deck, as well as SHRM and HRCI continuing education credits. Today's session should last for about 45 minutes, and that includes audience question and answer. So if you have a question, please type it in. You should see a GoToWebinar control box on somewhere on your screen. So type that question and we'll get to it either during the presentation or at the end during the dedicated Q&A session. So for those that are unfamiliar with Envoy, for nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, confusing, and frustrating immigration process. Envoy combines expert legal representation with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. Envoy secures work authorization in over 150 countries, has grown 41% year over year, and works with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. And I'm very excited today to introduce our main presenter, Christopher Preston, a managing attorney at Global Immigration Associates, Envoy's affiliated law firm. Christopher's practice focuses on helping businesses and their employees maneuver the U.S. legal immigration and work authorization landscape, including employment-based non-immigrant visas, such as the H-1B, L-1, O-1, E-2, E-3, B, and the TN. As well, he also helps with employment-based immigration matters, such as the PERM process, I-140 petitions, and adjustment of status applications. Prior to joining GIA, Christopher worked as an associate attorney at Ogletree. Christopher earned his JD with distinction from University of Nebraska, Lincoln College of Law, and he received his BA from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here. Welcome to everybody who's joined the call. Looks like we've got right around 100 people in the call and climbing a little bit. So welcome to everybody, and I think we're going to have a good conversation today.
Yep, you got a good audience. So before, Christopher, I turn it over to you, I just would like to quickly share a brief agenda for today's discussion. Just kind of really looking at starting with what NAFTA is, and then diving deeper into the USMCA and then the TN visa and how that may be impacted by this new trade deal. And as always, the content in this presentation is not intended as legal advice. For additional information, please consult with an Envoy affiliated attorney or another qualified professional. Okay, so Christopher, I got a general question for you. We hear the phrase NAFTA, but what exactly is NAFTA?
Sure, Eric. So NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's a trilateral trade agreement among Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And essentially what it did, or what it continues to do until the new agreement is ratified, is that it brings down a lot of barriers that exist between nations, including the exchange of goods and services, and most significantly, for purposes of our talk today, the exchange of people, the exchange of labor between those countries. I think, you know, the legacy of NAFTA is that it's accounted for something like $20 trillion in collective revenue among these three nations. So it's a big trade agreement. I think it is currently the largest trade agreement in the world in terms of dollar value. So it's been extremely prolific to facilitate exchange between the three major countries in North America. But given some perceived deficiencies in the agreement, the three countries, as I'm sure you're all aware, did engage in negotiations to revise that agreement per the urge of the Trump administration in 2017. As I think I can speak on behalf of the U.S. immigration bar, that when we started to learn more about the proposal to amend, if not totally scrap NAFTA, which was a lot of the rhetoric that was being used coming from the White House, there was a lot of concern in the U.S. immigration bar, particularly, obviously, with regard to the TN visa, which of course is what we're going to dive into here shortly. In early 2017, there was a ton of speculation about what is the future of the TN visa, because if we throw out NAFTA, we're basically throwing out the TN visa as well. So there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of concern out there among not only U.S. employers, but also the nationals who had come from Canada and Mexico into the United States to work here in the U.S. So, but as as the title of this presentation might belie the reality, the good news is essentially that there is no news. There is news, but the update about the USMCA and where it stands now is essentially that our fears in 2017 and even 2018 will not be realized. The TN visa it should be surviving this update in the USMCA agreement, and effectively the TN will remain intact and basically unaffected from how it was drafted in NAFTA. So, to get back to the original question, as part of this free trade agreement, these countries agreed that there should be a very liberalized exchange of labor among these three countries, and to that end, there was created a specific visa as part of that NAFTA agreement called the TN. And we'll get into exactly what that visa is all about, and how it is employers sponsor their employees for this visa, and how those employees actually apply directly to the U.S. government for that status. So we do have this new agreement, USMCA. I think, Eric, you can pop it. There you go. The United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. So it's pretty easy to remember acronym there. Just throw together all the countries, and it's an agreement between all those. Basically, if we flip to the next slide, what we're looking at here with this new agreement, which has yet to be ratified by all three countries, it's been ratified by Mexico. There's actually a lot of misunderstanding about this. This picture that you're looking at here, where we have the three leaders from these countries, they sign the agreement, but the agreement doesn't go into full force and effect until each of the three countries essentially legislates to accept the agreement. So the legislation process in the United States looks like a lot like a normal bill gets passed in Congress and signed by the president. And once all three countries legislate approval of the agreement and ratify it, as we call it, it will go into effect. So it's not quite in effect now, but essentially right now we have this agreement that's been signed. It's been approved by Justin Trudeau in Canada. Obviously, President Trump is fully behind it, and he is pushing Congress into ratifying it at the moment. And Mexico has actually gone through the the full process and is essentially waiting for the other two countries. So on this next slide, we have kind of the current status, which I kind of touched upon. The basic terms have been agreed to by the three countries, as you saw in that previous slide. And we are all good to go on Mexico's side, and Canada is basically in the legislation phase, as is the United States. So as we transition to the next slide, where are we here in the U.S.? Basically, right now, we're in a period where negotiations are still ongoing. It kind of slipped out of the news cycle earlier this year, but it's starting to pick up steam right now. A lot of political analysts, by the way, I should disclaim here, I'm not a political analyst. You're probably better off Googling and diving into the news stories about this for, forecasts about when this is likely to happen and exactly how it will happen. But I can tell you that right now, the news stories are picking up steam. This appears to be floating to the top of the priority list for the White House to get approved by the end of the year. I saw that just the other day, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, was interviewed and said that she feels confident that the Capitol Hill and White House are going to reach an agreement on this by the end of the year. But some things that are up for negotiation and debate right now are what you see in this slide. Enforcement of certain clauses that relate to labor and the environment, particularly labor. I think one of the biggest perceived shortfalls of NAFTA was that there wasn't enough teeth in the ability of one country to essentially enforce the labor standards found in NAFTA to another country. And so that right now is a huge point of negotiation with regard to the USMCA between the White House and Congress at the moment. There's also issues such as labor compliance, and as I said, environmental, climatological, and pharmaceutical concerns. So these are all being hashed out right now. I understand that there's nothing that Congress can vote on at the moment, but what we're seeing is that it's definitely picking up steam, and we expect something to happen by the end of the year.
Gotcha. So, Chris, we got one more slide in this section. Just curious if you can. So you said the TN visa, by all likelihood, isn't going to go away with the USMCA. But are there other maybe effects that the USMCA may have on the TN?
Yeah, it's a good question, Eric. And per the conversation we've been having so far, I mean, these topics of negotiation that Congress and the White House are engaged in are really not concerned with the TN. The TN visa has really kind of slipped out of the debate. So looking at the language that was agreed to by the three countries and the rhetoric that's being used today by the White House and Congress, this is pretty much, they're going to leave it alone. I mean, effectively, they're doing a copy and paste of NAFTA with regard to the TN. So we're feeling really confident that things are basically, they're for all intents and purposes going to stay the same. There were some in the early stages before this was actually signed between all three countries. There was a lot of rhetoric coming out of the White House to potentially limit the scope of the TN visa, making it look similar to other visas like the H-1B that has a federally mandated annual cap. H-1B visas are limited to 160,000, and so once that number is hit, effectively the remainder the applicants for that particular visa have to enter into a lottery system. There was some talk about implementing a similar measure for the TN visa so as to limit the number of people who could take advantage of the TN visa. There was also some push, which actually, in my opinion, this probably would have been beneficial to update the list of eligible occupations within the agreement that are eligible for TN status. But That didn't happen either. So at the end of the day, all of these proposals to limit or change or amend what the TN visa was all about in the agreement ultimately went away. And as we state here, it's basically become a copy and paste job from the original NAFTA. It's really going to look and act the same as it has in the past. So.
Gotcha. Cool. So moving along to our next section here, obviously, Chris, you've been talking a lot about the TN visa, so we'd like to transition to just kind of an overview of the TN visa. And again, just really want to start with a very high-level question. What is the TN visa, and how does it work?
Absolutely. So the TN visa is non-immigrant employment authorized visa for the United States. So let me kind of unpack that. Non-immigrant. Non-immigrant basically means that it's temporary. It's a guest worker status, and the intent of the holder is to work temporarily in the United States and then return to their home country, i.e., Canada or Mexico. It is employment authorized visa, so the person has, the TN recipient has the ability to work and to live in the United States temporarily. However, one thing to keep in mind is that the TN is employer specific, so it is not an unrestricted right to work. It is tied directly to not only the a single employer, but also to a type of work. So if I go to work for ABC Corp and they sponsor me for a TN visa to work as a lawyer, I have to work for ABC Corp and I have to work as a lawyer. And if one of those things changes, it becomes a problem. So it is strictly limited to the terms and conditions of the employment that is made out in that application. Who is eligible for a TN visa? We're talking again about Mexicans and Canadians. And what's interesting about this visa is that it's we in the U.S. immigration world have to deal with a lot of nebulous terms to try to fit people into certain visa categories. A good example is the H-1B, which is for individuals filling a specialty occupation, quote unquote. What is a specialty occupation? I can tell you that question is a constant source of contention between employers and the U.S. government, with us in the middle, facilitating and assisting the visa process for our clients. But contrary to that, the TN, which again arises from NAFTA, within the NAFTA treaty, it's literally a list of occupations and the qualifications that a person must have to fit into that occupation. So it just says it right there, right in the treaty, who can apply and what they need to be eligible for that visa. There is some gray area sometimes. For example, what is an engineer? Sometimes that can get a little bit nebulous. Or what is a computer systems analyst? And or even better, what is an economist? Which is a source of a lot of debate in this area. But for the most part, it is much more cut and dry than other visa types when it comes to the terminology and the eligibility tests compared to other visas. So let's kind of dive into this. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna ask, what are some of the advantages of the TN? I believe earlier you mentioned as we see here on the first bullet point, there is not an annual cap. But so can you dive a little bit deeper into that and some other advantages of the TN?
Absolutely. So there is no limitation on the number of TN visas that can be issued by the U.S. government. That's obviously very good. So we don't have to expect a lottery system or something similar to that anytime soon. No prescribed wage levels set by the Department of Labor. So in the context of an H-1B visa, which I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with, if not, there are wage controls when it comes to the H-1B. Employers must pay what's known as the required wage to the H-1B beneficiary, which is either the higher of an actual wage paid to similarly employed individuals, or the prevailing wage. Prevailing wage is a key term that we throw around a lot in the H-1B context, which is essentially a wage rate that the U.S. Department of Labor has determined to be applicable to a certain occupation in a certain geographical area. None of that applies to the TN. There's really no wage controls. I will put a caveat on this, though. Wage issues can play into a more sort of holistic analysis of whether an individual is a profession under the professional under the TN visa. So, for example, if you sponsor an individual for a TN under the engineer occupation and you pay that person $22,000 a year, that is not a wage control issue, but you will get a lot of eyebrows raised by the U.S. government thinking, well, maybe this person isn't an engineer because they're not making that much money. So it's a little bit of a yes, for the most part, there are no wage controls, but we need to be mindful of the income that the person is making. Number three, which I think is really kind of tops when it comes to the advantages. The TN visa really is a fast and efficient visa to apply for and be issued, provided that the application is approvable. A lot of many, if not most, visas must first go through a round of review by the U.S. agency that are responsible for adjudicating and dispensing immigration benefits in the United States. That's USCIS, or U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which sits under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The TN visa does not require us to go through DHS or USCIS. Instead, the TN visa is administered. It's actually different on either side of the United States. In Mexico, it's administered by the U.S. Department of State, specifically the U.S. embassies and consulates in Mexico. And in Canada, it's administered and adjudicated by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is actually, it's very unique in the immigration context that you have the people manning the border responsible for reviewing and adjudicating and looking into the legal issues that come under the TN visa. For the case of Canadians, this can be a same-day process. You take your documents to the port of entry. That can be the airport or the land border crossing. You submit them to CBP. They review, they approve, they let you in, and you're a TN. For folks down in Mexico, it's a little bit different. The individual has to first apply for an appointment at the U.S. Embassy or consulate. That's subject to appointment availability, but once they've had their appointment, usually it's 2 to 3 business days by the time they have their visa back. So we're talking matter of days as opposed to a matter of weeks or months if we filed with USCIS. So that's a huge advantage. Also, with regard to the TN, spouses and dependent children are eligible for a dependent visa. It's called the TD, and that facilitates travel for those folks as well. One thing to point out, there is no work authorization or EAD eligibility for TD holders, so that is unfortunately a disadvantage at this moment, but the family can travel along with the primary TN.
Gotcha. And so, Chris, you mentioned this a couple minutes ago regarding eligibility and occupation. So just wanted to briefly bring this slide up. And for our attendees, when you receive this slide deck tomorrow afternoon, you'll see there that you can click to view the full list of the occupations. Of course, I know you talked a lot in detail about this earlier, a couple minutes ago, but just curious if there's anything else to add to this regarding eligibility criteria.
Yeah, I would invite everybody here to check out the list. It really is a list, and as simple as it seems, this is really the boundary lines of the TN visa. And you'll see, let's take accountant for example. You'll see that it's there on the list, and following the in the little listing for accountant, it says bachelor's degree, or what's known as a licenciatura degree, which is essentially the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in Mexico, or CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. And so it lists the credentials that a person must have. And so for any TN case, we're looking at the offer of employment to ensure that the job is going to fit into one of these occupations. We're also looking at the individual's credentials to ensure that they have what NAFTA says is required for that particular occupation. So I invite everybody to play around with that list, see what's in there, get familiar with it, because that is our first and only source of essentially the legal framework for who is eligible for the TN visa.
Awesome. And so moving along, shifting gears to the validity period. What can you tell our attendees about the validity period of the TN?
Absolutely. So TN visas are valid, and I want to be careful about the terminology. So, and this is particularly relevant for folks from Mexico. You'll hear the word visa used interchangeably. In the strict sense of the word, visa means that the document that is pasted into the person's passport and allows them to apply for admission to the United States. I'll use the term status to refer to the person's, status in the United States. What classification and duration of stay has the government given the individual? The TN for both Mexicans and Canadians gives the person 3 years of status, of TN status in the United States before that status needs to be renewed. So it says right here, initial stay of 3 years, and that status can be renewed for increments of 3 years, basically indefinitely. There is no cap on the amount of time a person can stay on a TN visa. There are some questions that relate to non-immigrant intent. If a person continues to repeatedly renew that TN status for, let's say 20, 25 years, the government may start to think, okay, maybe this person really is residing here and should get a green card. But for the most part, people usually don't extend beyond 10 or 15 years. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the total duration of time that a person can remain on the status. Now, when it comes to the visa, what's important to understand here is that Canadians are visa exempt, which essentially means they don't have to apply for a formal visa in their passport. They simply, just as a U.S. citizen can travel to Ireland, for example, they don't need a visa. They're admitted in with just their passport. Same with Canadians. They apply for a TN. They're granted 3 years of TN status. They never actually need a visa. Mexicans, on the other hand, do need a visa, hence the requirement to visit the U.S. Embassy or consulate. And the visa stamp that is placed into the individual's passport is only going to be valid for 1 year. So this is a big source of confusion. The individual from Mexico gets a visa stamp that's valid for 1 year, which essentially means that for 1 year they have the ability to travel into the United States. But once they travel into the United States, they should be granted a 3-year period of TN status. So there's a little bit of a distinction between how long can they travel and how long can they and for what duration can they spend in TN status in the United States. One of the reasons why this is kind of a source of contention for us is that for some reason we haven't been able to get U.S. Customs and Border Protection to pay attention to the status validity. They continue to refer to the visa stamp validity. So in a lot of cases, you'll see that Mexican nationals are only admitted for the duration of their visa, which is only valid for up to 1 year. Sometimes people get lucky and they get a well-educated officer who does admit them for 3 years, but this is a problem that's ongoing in U.S. immigration law. Truthfully, both Mexicans and Canadians should be admitted to the United States for 3-year periods based on the validity of the petition that they initially submitted. So, and of course, we put the disclaimer here to speak to an attorney if you have questions about the validity of your stay or your visa, or the total duration of your stay and the temporary nature of your presence in the U.S.
Great. So now moving along to the maybe a little bit of the finer details here regarding the TN visa application process. So Christopher, if someone or if an employer or they're looking into the TN, what are some important documents that they need to account for?
Absolutely. So these are the documents, and let me kind of go through these. You know, and when we think about it, you know, the TN visa is for Mexicans and Canadians filling specific occupational roles in the United States who have the proper credentials and the intent to return to their home country. I didn't actually read that. I totally said that off the top of my head, and I think I did a pretty good job. Those are the basic elements of the TN visa. And so when we think about those elements, we look at this checklist, right? So Mexican or Canadian. So we need proof of citizenship. So that's obviously going to be, obviously if the person is traveling, they're going to have their passport. So they're going to have their passport handy when they go to apply. Second, they're filling a specific occupational role. So we're looking for offer of employment letter. In a lot of ways, if you utilize our services, we are drafting a letter that memorializes the offer of employment, discusses the duties and responsibilities of the position and the minimum credentials that are required for the job. And by extension, we need the credentials of the individual. So diploma, transcripts, resume, and if education was gained outside the United States, we'll also send them along with an educational equivalency evaluation, which is basically a report made by an evaluator that equates the non-U.S. degree to a U.S. degree. So it'll be a piece of paper that says, we've reviewed his coursework and this is equivalent to a U.S. bachelor's degree in X. And then finally, there are some TN occupations that require that we show the person has a certain amount of experience, and we'll be reaching out for experience letters from previous employers to prove that down. If the person has dependents traveling with them, of course, we'll need proof of family relationship. So for spouses, a marriage certificate, for children, a birth certificate, and their passports as well. So those are the main documents that an application will consist of.
Awesome. And the final slide that we have here as I move along is just kind of some of the costs associated. So what are some costs that attendees should be aware of?
Absolutely. So one of the great advantages of TN that we didn't actually bring up previously is cost to the employer. This is a relatively low-cost process, with the caveat that if you are covering the expense of the person traveling to the border or the consulate, that's actually probably going to be your biggest source of your biggest expense for this process, actually getting the person to the place where they need to apply. But in terms of the application fees themselves, it's a little bit different for Mexicans and Canadians. For Canadians, being able to apply directly at the port of entry eliminates any fees associated with the formal visa application process. But right now, Customs and Border Protection is charging a nominal fee, which I think by last check is about $50. It's just a processing fee to have them review and adjudicate the application. There is, however, for Mexicans, there is what we call the MRV fee, which is basically the fee paid anytime anybody applies for a visa stamp, and that's $160 at this point. There are no government filing fees, as there are with, say, for example, an L1 visa. So this is basically it. One thing we haven't talked about yet is that we do have, even though I've mentioned that we have the advantage of staying away from USCIS, we also have the option of applying with USCIS if we have to. Some certain, some specific examples of this are if we were to see a TN application denied at the port of entry or at the U.S. consulate in Mexico, we could use as a contingency option filing a petition with USCIS as opposed to having the person reapply. Once USCIS approves the petition, it's strictly a matter of taking that approval notification to the port of entry or to the consulate, and usually the agency there will defer to USCIS's decision. There are also some cases where we might feel a little bit on the fence about the person's eligibility for the visa, and we don't want to take the risk of sending them up to the border or down to the consulate and possibly risk seeing them denied. So we may do the safe route and file with USCIS first, because, like I said, once USCIS has approved it, the agencies outside the U.S. will typically defer to that decision. And if we do file with USCIS, there is a $460 filing fee. If we want to expedite that with premium processing, which means we get a result in less than 15 days, that'll be approximately $1,400. So it kind of gives you an idea of the advantage of sending a TN directly to the border or the consulate. You get to forego these fees, but we do have the option to use USCIS if we need to.
Great. And so, Christopher, that's going to bring us to the end of the main presentation here. So we discussed a lot, starting with, obviously what, recap of NAFTA, and then kind of overview of the USMCA, and then the details of the TN visa. So my final question for you from my end is just really what would be a main takeaway for our attendees from today's webinar regarding the TN, and I guess some things to keep an eye out for in the future.
Sure, absolutely. For employers, if you are sourcing employees from who hail from Canada or Mexico, and then I would strongly advise you to check out the list of occupations that we gave you a link for in the slides. You can also Google, NAFTA, TN, visa occupations. It's pretty easily discoverable. And if you feel that the person will be offered a job in in one of those categories, just know that you've got a real leg up here. That the TN visa it's a frequently used resource for getting folks from Canada and Mexico into the U.S. into a work authorized status. I guess final thoughts. I mean, I in terms of what is the sort of state of play for the TN visa right now, what I would say, and this is just my, professional opinion as an attorney who works in this field, TNs continue to be quite stable in terms of approval ratings, particularly in Mexico. The Department of State, which traditionally has been an agency that values the exchange of people and of travelers and culture among nations, I think continues to be pretty favorable to the TN. On the other hand, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, I certainly don't want to fearmonger, but CBP has a little bit of a different, I'm not going to say agenda, but a different mission that underlines their agency, and that is to protect the United States, which I think these days captures more and more the idea that we need to value U.S. workers. So I will say that we have, that CBP has been, they have applied a little bit more scrutiny to the TN visa in the last few years, but we continue to get a vast majority of our TN applications approved at the border, we do a lot of these, and so if you ever have any questions, concerns, or needs for assistance with regard to TNs, we definitely have a lot of experience in this field, and we know the right way to do this, and so we encourage you to reach out to us. But that is all I have. I look forward to answering any questions that our attendees have, and I want to thank everybody for joining today.
Yeah, Christopher, no, thank you so much for the presentation. It was super, super informative, and we're getting a ton of great questions, so we're going to hop in there. Just again, as a reminder, for if you do have a question that you would like to ask, we really can only answer some very general questions. It can't get into case specific stuff. So if you please consult with an immigration counsel for those matters. Chris, can foreign nationals on a TN visa apply for a green card?
That's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack with that question. Let me kind of start by saying that the TN is a non-immigrant visa, and if an individual has expressed their interest or they have been sponsored for permanent residence, it's going to be very difficult to get a TN visa issued to that person. But if the individual is currently in TN status in the United States, then let me just say this: we have successfully applied, assisted individuals in applying for a green card and receiving a green card in the U.S. in TN status. It's just that once you hit a certain point in the green card process, specifically once your employer files your I-140 or once you file your adjustment of status application or your green card application, it then becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible, to renew your TN status. So you need to look very closely at the timing to ensure you are in a fresh period of TN status before you take that leap. But it's not as if once you apply for the green card that your TN status is going to be taken away. Part of the legal landscape here is that the government understands, thankfully, that intentions can change, that you weren't necessarily lying 2 years ago when you applied for a TN because now you're applying for a green card. There is some room for flexibility there, and we do and have assisted TN holders through the green card process successfully.
Awesome, thanks. Chris, next question here is, how does the TN visa compare with the L1 in terms of advantages?
Great question. Similarities is that the person does have full work authorization in the United States pursuant to the terms and conditions of the petition, the application that was originally submitted. The person has to continue working according to the employer that sponsored that petition and the job that was listed therein. And so the person, can live and work here in the U.S. They both statuses have full authorization to work. I will say that, I guess the question may be pondering, maybe this person is not the person who answered the question, but a hypothetical person is Canadian or Mexican, and they're transferring in from one of their affiliates overseas, which I should have prefaced that the L1 visa, for those of you who don't know, is for employees within multinational corporations who are transferring from a non-U.S. affiliate into the U.S. company. If I'm looking at a case where it's potential that the person can qualify for both, it'll really depend, on what the person is doing. I would say that if the person has, the immediate desire to apply for a green card, the L1 is better because the L1 is not what we call a dual intent visa, which means you can intend to become a permanent resident of the U.S. on an L1. But if the person is in a very solid TN occupation and they meet all the eligibility qualifications, it'll be case specific. But there are instances where we will put the person in TN status, and so the advantages of TN do hold for this question. What I would say is that Mexicans, if the person is eligible for an L1, they will have to go through USCIS. There is a difference with Canadians. In fact, the Canadians can apply for an L1 directly at the port of entry. So if you're Canadian and you're eligible for L1 and TN, all I can say is it's a big fat it depends. We're going to take a very close look at the case.
Gotcha. So I know we're at 1:45, but there are a ton of great questions. So if our attendees and Christopher, if it's okay with you, would like to extend it for another 5 minutes.
That's absolutely absolutely we can do that.
Perfect. So we're getting a couple of questions regarding the consistency of USCIS and CBP regarding on how they the definitions of certain TN professions.
Sure.
So, Chris, are you able to say, in your experience, what are professional occupations you're seeing that have the most pushback?
That's an outstanding question, and it's something that we think about a lot in this area. I can say, from my experience, some of the strongest occupations, I'll start with the good news. The strongest occupations, particularly for our clientele, the engineering category. Engineers really very rarely receive pushback when it comes to occupational grounds on their application. It's only if the person is doing something that might be considered an offshoot of engineering. A great example is construction manager. You're not going to find construction manager on the TN list of occupations, but they do a lot of engineering type work. And so, but unless, as long as the person is doing engineering work and has an engineering degree, it's going to be a very strong case, unless there are case specific things that might hold it up. In terms of, what are the biggest points of contention, where are the areas of most pushback? Economist is one that we get a lot of requests from clients for people in business areas that don't really fall under any of the other occupations. A great example is finance or marketing or business administration. And a lot of practitioners will try to shoehorn that into the economist occupation. And it used to be the case that the government really didn't crack down on this that hard. As long as we made a colorable argument that the person was doing things that were economics related, they would get through. These days, the agencies really have started to take a harder line. The person really needs to be doing things that an economist traditionally does, specifically forecasting, looking at, trends in the marketplace, doing reporting and, analytics and in economics related topic. So that is one that has been kind of a hill on which we fought CBP. Another greatest hit here is management consultant, which has traditionally been considered a little bit of a catch-all for individuals who don't fit into one of the other occupations, but it's extremely important to understand that, again, CBP is taking a little bit stricter line than they used to. For people who are going to have strong cases in this occupation, they really need to be coming from outside the organization, filling a temporary need that is not defined. It is not a defined role within the organization. It's really kind of considered a supernumerary. We need to bring this person in temporarily to talk to our management teams to optimize operations and improve business, et cetera, et cetera. So, these are a couple things where recently a lot of practitioners have tried to fit a round peg into a square hole, or the opposite, square peg into a round hole. And CBP has in particular has taken a little bit harder stance against these. So we have to be very cautious, and we'll take a very close look at the offer of employment when it comes to assessing the likelihood of approval for those types of occupations.
Great. Thanks for answering that one. And our final question, it's going to be kind of a combination of some similarly worded questions. Chris, is it possible, or along that vein, how does transferring a TN visa work? Is that at all possible? Again, combining a couple questions here. So I think the general thought is if there's someone on TN status changes employers,
Sure, absolutely. There is a process, and again, it's kind of bifurcated between: are we sending the individual outside to the port of entry or to the consulate, or are we going through USCIS? USCIS, just to start there, we can file a petition that basically effectuates a change of employer for the TN, and that is more strictly considered a transfer, quote unquote, because we use that terminology to basically change the individual status while remaining in the United States. But a lot of times, most of the time, provided the case is strong enough, we're going to simply send the person up with a new application to apply again with a TN based on the new employer's offer of employment, and then send that individual back to the port of entry up in Canada or to the consulate or embassy down in Mexico. And it's not really considered a transfer per se. It's more of a new application. You're essentially saying, please grant me a new TN period of status based on this new employer. It's something that we do a lot. And so absolutely, if individuals have the ability to change employers, that can be facilitated pretty rapidly. There are a lot of concerns I've dealt with when it comes to notice of term, or 2 weeks notice, 4 weeks notice, giving notice to your employer to quit. That gets a little tricky because once you leave the country and apply for a new TN and you're approved, when you come in, you're expected and required to start working for that new employer. So we either, essentially it kind of sets you up for a little bit of a leap of faith that the application is going to be approved. If the individual is not comfortable with that leap of faith, then it probably makes more sense to apply through USCIS. That way you can kind of control the timing of 2 weeks notice, termination, onboarding with a new employer. So these are all case specific things that we'll look at. Most of the time though, if a person wants to change employer, the most simple way to do that is to simply submit a new application to the government at the port of entry or the consulate.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that one, and thank you so much for in general presenting today's webinar and taking the time to answer these questions. I know we went a couple minutes over, so I don't want to keep anyone longer than necessary. So Chris, again, big thank you for today's presentation. For our attendees, thank you for joining us. There were a ton of more great questions, but again, we can only can't answer all of them. For those very specific ones, please consult with Immigration Counsel for more information. So again, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for our attendees, and we'll see you at the next webinar. As another reminder, this recording will be emailed out tomorrow afternoon, in addition with the slide deck and the SHRM and HRCI continuing education credits. Have a great rest of your day and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.